Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the techniques circling fans and some of the more important theories, principles, rules, concepts, and strategies of this technique. So let's start out with the general strategy of this technique. It's basically positioning our opponent where we want and doing that through a variety of different means. So keep that in mind, that we're going to be overwhelming this opponent through manipulation. So now that we've talked about manipulation, let's talk about how it's being done here. Standard manipulation is through sustained contact, where I want to position my opponent, but I do it through sustained contact. But that's not the only way we can position our opponent. We're doing it in a slightly different way, or another way to think about it is an opposite way. Rather than doing it through sustained motion, we're doing it through striking. So as we move forward through this technique, keep in mind that we're going to be doing manipulation, but the manipulation is going to be done primarily through striking. Okay, so now that we've talked through that, let's talk through the beginning of this technique. It's a left-right punch combination, also known as flight majors. So why is it left-right? Well, if you do this technique properly, you generally don't have to do the left-right. So then why are we showing the left-right? Well, category completion. Basically, we could do a left, we could do a right, or we could do a left-right or a right-left. It doesn't really matter in this technique. But our techniques are designed to show us the long versions of the technique. That's why we do the left-right. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about what's going on here and how we're starting to employ our strategy. So if we look at this punch, what we're doing is we're doing this parry. But it's not just a parry, it's a special type of parry. It's a frictional pull parry. So let's get into frictional pulls. Frictional pulls are a degree of pulling. Another way to think about it is standard pulls are we do a grab that way, a grab that way, or a grab that way, and then we're using the grab, and that grab creates friction in order to pull. Well, we don't need the grab piece, and that's demonstrated here. As we begin to do the parry, we're using that pulling and friction of the hand in order to draw them towards us. Okay, sounds good. But let's talk about one other element that we may have overlooked here, margin for error. Well, standard way of dealing with this punch is this way. Why? Because we want margin for error. Let's get into the details of it, why we still have margin for error. Well, if we look at this version, what we've done is we've got margin for error on a vertical plane. In other words, the hand can go up and down through a large degree, and I can make errors and I can still block it. But that's not the only dimension. We have 3 dimensions. So in this case, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be transferring our margin for error from a vertical plane to a horizontal plane. And that's the dimension of depth. And if you'll notice, without the parries, and it begins to punch, I'm going to draw back and draw back again. So that's where I'm moving my margin for error to. That allows us to use the tip of the weapon rather than the edge of the weapon. So if we combine all this together, this is what we're going to get, this effect. Now, there's one other thing we have to talk about at this point. Power principles. What am I using here? If you think about it, we have 3 power principles. We have torque, which is primarily around the dimension of width. We have gravitational marriage, which is primarily around the dimension of height. And we have backup mesh, which is through depth. Okay, so we have our 3 dimensions. The 2 that are basically the same are backup mass and gravitational marriage. Okay, so the difference being that gravitation piece, not just the planes, but also the gravitation. That's an external force that pulls us to the ground, and we're going to be taking advantage of that as we go forward. Now, this technique, all throughout the technique, starts combining power principles. In this case, primarily backup mass and gravitational marriage. So the way we're doing it this at the beginning of the technique is as we begin to draw back, that's our backup mass, and our settle, that's our gravitational marriage. Okay? And follow up with the second one. We're going to be doing this away from the opponent at the beginning and towards the opponent as we go forward, so keep that in mind also. So, now that we've done this piece here and we've walked through all this, let's get into the next piece. That next piece brings in some other concepts. Let's start out with opposing forces. That's a good one to start with. So what have I done? I've drawn myself away. I begin to kick this opponent. Why is it opposing forces? Because they're coming towards me. Remember, I'm pulling them. I'm manipulating to me. So what I'm doing is I'm doing that kick to take advantage of that through them coming towards me and me away from them. Also keep in mind our strategy. We're manipulating. Why are we doing that? because we want them to bend forward right into our punch. And again, through manipulation, we stand them back up again. So we're using bar force in order to enhance the strikes, and then manipulation in order to position where we want them to be. So now that we've gotten to that piece, let's go to the next piece. There's some different options here based upon what's happening with their hands. If their hands are in our way, we can simply use our right hand in order to check them and move it into our next piece. Very straightforward, but let's get into an advanced version of this, or a different option. This brings in the reaction response mechanism. So what is that? So the relaxation response mechanism is the fact that if I start to hit this person, they begin to tense up typically, especially if they see it. If they see it, they tend to tense up. But at some point, they begin to loosen up. And that's when we do our follow-up strike. So if you'll notice the way this technique is timed, I do the hit, and then I give a little bit of delay, and then drop into the next piece. Why? For that relaxation response mechanism. So keep in mind our strategy. The strategy is to manipulate this opponent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my gap on this opponent because I want to start using that opposite of depth and go into the height. So remember, we're combining power principles together. So the way this works in this case is I begin to settle in this stance. What I'm going to use this right hand for is to gauge them where I want them to be without pushing them. And the same with this left hand. In other words, this one has primarily height and a little bit depth. This one has, this one has primary depth, but a little bit of height. Okay. Another way to think about this is how both gravitation marriage and backup mass are done. Mostly speaking, our mass is behind the weapon. So if you notice what we've done basically up to now, our mass is behind the weapon, except in the beginning, it was basically in front of the weapon. So if you'll notice, I'm pulling them to me rather than away from me. So you could theoretically say the backup mass is pulling rather than pushing. Okay? So if you think about this, it's the same way. Now there's another way in which we can do it. And that is where our mass is actually in front of the weapon completely, but that's really not demonstrated here. But what is demonstrated here is the fact that once we get through this knee, we'll get into that in just a second, what we're going to be using here is direct opposites. In other words, I'm going to keep my mass out of the situation and I'm going to allow the direct opposite motions in order to create the power in what we're working on. So let's get back to that in just a second, and let's get back to this knee just for a second. If you'll notice, what's happening here is the opposite of what we just did with this piece. In other words, we're pushing them down, now we're pushing them up, and now we're getting that knee to position them where we want them to be. The major difference between the two is that gravity piece, right? These, I'm actually pushing them to the ground, getting them where I want to be. This one pushes up. But why don't they just leave? Because gravity is keeping them in place. And that takes us into the next piece here, the ground. We're being pulled into the ground here, right? So I have ground reaction force. So what is ground reaction force? It's one of Newton's laws of motion. What's happening here is as I begin to apply power to the ground is applying power to me at the exact same time. So as we always like to do in Kenpo, we take advantage of forces. In others, what's happening is as it begins to apply power back to me, I can use that to come up through my body into this forearm strike. So we're going to hit at the exact same time where that power generates up through my body into my arm, allowing me to enhance that strike. Also, through the way I'm doing it, I have a structure. Now, the key piece here is what I was talking about here earlier was direct opposites. If you notice, my mass does not have any effect on this strike. It is centered mass. That's the way we want to think about this. And instead of being in front of or behind what's going on, it's basically disengaged and allowing the direct opposites to generate that power. Okay, so now that we've talked about through all that, let's talk about the ending of this technique. Typically speaking, we are left either in the middle or we disengage from a fight. So in this case, we disengage, but not fully. If you notice, all I did was cross out. I didn't do the cover piece. So what's the difference? Well, this is just a cross out, which gives me 180-degree view. Typically what we do is the cover to give us 360-degree view. But why didn't we do that? Because we disengaged from the opponent, but we realized we needed to do something more to this opponent. So that shows us that we can re-engage this opponent in order to do that kick on the opponent. The interesting thing is how we did it. The way we left was through a front crossover, and now we're just showing you the opposite, doing the rear crossover in order to get to that kick. But now that we've done that re-engagement piece to show it to you, guess what? We're going to do the cross out and then cover to get that full 360-degree cover view. Okay, so now that we've talked through all the different concepts, theories, principles, ideas, etc., let's do a really slow demonstration so you can see it being executed. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.